This month we're going to do 2 paper pieced blocks. The first one is Duck and Ducklings, which is the D block, and that is going to be from these 4 fabrics. And then the other one we're going to make 2 blocks, and it is the Turnstile block, or the T block, and it uses a light and a dark in each block. We're going to trim our fabric pieces down so that they fit our paper piece blocks better. And also, it can help keep your grain lines going the right direction. You don't necessarily have to do that for paper piecing. So from our black piece for the D block, we are going to cut 2 2¼ inch squares. So I'm going to clean cut 2 edges, which is probably not absolutely necessary because these are going to be oversized. 2¼ times 2 is 4½. So I'm going to line up my 4½ inch mark with the short side that I clean cut, and then the 2¼ on the long side, and cut, and then back off to the 2¼ and as always I keep the long sides lined up as well to keep everything straight. And then both of these squares are cut in half on the diagonal. So we're going to go point to point, cut only once on the diagonal, so we will end up with 4 triangles out of the black. In addition to our 4 triangles out of the black, we also need 1 2-inch square, which I forgot when I was cutting it originally. I thought I had an awful lot left on the end. From the red, I'm going to cut 2 3½ inch blocks, and it's not too much too big, so I'm just going to clean cut 2 edges. And then 3½ times 2 is 7. So I'm lining my 7-inch mark up on my short clean cut edge and my 3½ inch mark on the long, and cut. And then back my ruler up to 3½ inches. And again, we're cutting this in half on the diagonal, once for each square, which will give us 4 triangles. From the gold, we want 4 2-inch squares. So, again, I always want to start with 2 straight edges. 2 times 4 is 8. So I'm going to line my 8 up on my short straight edge and my 2 on the long one. And then back up to the 6-inch mark. And I am keeping lines along the long edges as well. Cut. Back up to my 4-inch mark. Cut. And then back up to my 2-inch mark. Cut. So I have my 4 squares. From our beige, or in our case our cream, we need to cut 6 2¼ inch squares, and also we're going to cut 4 2-inch squares. So the first, I have folded my strip in half because it's a little bit longer than the ruler, and I'm going to clean cut 2 edges. We do not have a ton of extra fabric. You will all have a selvage on one end, so I want to cut that off, but not much more. So I line up my ruler, one of the marks with the fold on this end because we want to keep it straight, and then come in and cut off the short end. I'm going to rotate this. We do want to keep it even with what we just did, so I could have walked around or rotated the mat. I'm going to leave it folded double, so I really only need to cut 3 out of the 2 layers, so that'll be a total of 6. So I'm going to line up my 2 1/4 mark with the long edge, and 2 1/4 times 3 is 6 3/4. So I'm lining up 6 3/4 here, 2 1/4 here. I'm going to cut and then cut again. Move this out of the way. Now I'm going to back off to 4 1/2. And now it doesn't matter which line I'm running along the long edges, but I do like to keep lines along that to keep everything straight. Cut, and then move back to 2 1/4 and cut. And all of these are going to be cut in half once on the diagonal so that we end up with 12 triangles. So I just line up my ruler point to point. And getting too far over with the tripod in the way. So again, point to point. From what's left of our cream or our beige, we need 4 2-inch squares. I still have it folded in half. You can unfold it if you want to. There's not hardly any extra. I mean, it's just barely going to make it in there. So my 4-inch line marked up here, my 2-inch line lined up along the long edge. If I'm off, if it's a hair small, it's okay. They are slightly oversized. Then I'm going to back up to my 2-inch mark and cut. So that gives me my 4 2-inch squares. I have taken my original patterns and copied them onto foundation paper. For this pattern, we don't care, but when you're paper piecing, if you are paper piecing letters or anything that you want to face a specific direction with this method, you want to make sure that your pattern is reversed. But we're good just copying it exactly the way it is. I have a copier printer combination, so I just put it in there and copied it. If you don't have it and don't want to take it to the printer, you could always trace it. You could use your original pattern. I don't recommend it. The pattern you're getting in your kits each month is a $25 retail pattern, so I would save it. The foundation paper is kind of like newsprint. It tears away easier. You could use printer paper if you wanted to. This just makes your life a little easier. One more thing, if you were doing a quilt that had a whole bunch of the same blocks, you want to keep copying from your original copy, not from your copies, and you also don't want to switch copiers because it can distort slightly. Both patterns are going to, or both blocks are going to be put together in sections. This is one block and there are 7 sections. So what I would recommend you do is cut apart the sections. I'm not cutting exactly on the line. You can if you want to, and you could use scissors. So I'm just cutting between the dotted seam allowances. And so that I have each section separated to work with it. For machine setup, I like to use an open toe foot. If you don't have an open toe foot, just pick a foot that you can see well. And then also for the needle, you can go to a larger size needle. You could bump up to a 90. That would make it easier to tear away your paper in the end. The other thing I'm going to do is shorten my stitch length. The standard is 2.5. I dropped it to 1.5. You could drop it to a 1. Just realize that the shorter your stitch length is, if you mess up, the harder it is to tear out. So I'm going with a 1.5. The pattern has a key, which will make our life a little bit easier when we go trying to put this together. So BL is black, BE is beige, R is red, and G is gold. I'm going to start with the strip that's 5 squares. It'll be fairly simple sewing. My number one, B1, so this is section B, is BE, so beige. So on the wrong side of my pattern, I'm going to put the number 1 with the wrong side against the paper. I can look with the light behind it and see that I have at least 1/4 inch seam here. And for this piece, I am going to put a pin in there to hold it in place. So that's the first piece. My next piece on here is G, so that's gold. So I'm going to take my gold piece, again, on the wrong side. This time I'm going to go right sides together, and because I pre-cut these, I can just match it up here with the edge of my beige. I'm going to go ahead and move the pin so that it's holding both of them together. Now I'm going to sew on this line between B1 and B2. I want to start in my seam allowance. The dark solid lines are my finished pieces. I like to sew with the needle down. My goal is to be right on that line. And when I get to the other end, I'm just going to sew right off into the seam allowance. Now I can take the pin out, and before I do anything else, I want to fold this piece down, and I want to check on the other side to make sure that it's covering my lines, and it is. Before I press or move on to add another piece, I want to trim my seam allowance so I have a nice even seam allowance. So these are 2 good options. This is the original add a quarter, and it has a groove here that sits over my seam allowance. This is the add a quarter plus. It also has the groove here. If you're using the original add a quarter, you're also going to want a piece of cardstock, a note card, something like that. If you're using the plus, it has an edge that is narrower on this side that takes the place of that. So if I'm using the original one, I want to place my note card on the line. I want to fold back on the note card, and then I'm going to put my add a quarter on here, and it's pretty good already, and I'm going to trim that seam allowance off to 1/4 inch. I'll show you the plus when I do the next seam. When I'm paper piecing, I like to have a small cutting mat and pressing surface right next to the machine so I don't have to be jumping up and down, because they're usually short seams. And I'm using a cute little iron. It is not absolutely necessary. Any size iron will work. So I'm just pressing my seam as it was stitched. Then I'm flipping up my gold, and I'm pressing the seam toward the gold. That's the only way I can go. At this point, I can use my add a quarter again so that I get this accurate right now rather than after the fact. So it can go either way. So I'm using the plus this time. I'm putting the slanted edge down on the line. I'm folding back on that line. In this case, I'm going to pull that out of there, and then I'm going to use the ridge size right over the top of the paper and trim. So now I have my 1/4 inch already. My next piece is B1 or BL, and it's B3 is the piece. So it's going to be a black piece. I flip it over to the side that doesn't have the pattern printed on it. Line up my raw edge with my raw edge on the one that I just trimmed. And again, I'm going to pin. And I'm ready to stitch on this line, the line between B2 and B3. So I'm exactly the same again. I'm starting off the edge and the seam allowance and stitching on the line. When I get to the other end, I stitch into the seam allowance. I am not tying a knot on either end. and cut. And I really shouldn't need to trim it again because I already did my add a quarter. So again, I'm just pressing my seam flat. And then it's going, the only way it can go now is toward the black. Now again, I can put my add a quarter plus down or my note card, fold up, and then I'm going to just butt that ridge right up against the paper and trim off. My next piece is a G, so it is gold again. And do note that our golds are directional, so if you want them to go in any specific direction, pay attention when you're putting them down. On this piece, I'm going to keep them going this way. Then on the other pieces, I'll probably have them going out. So, just going to put my two raw edges together and pin again and stitch again. And I'm going to keep doing that until I finish this strip or this section. I'm finished piecing this center strip. I went ahead and put the last one on and just kept pressing. And once I had everything on, I stitched inside the seam allowance all the way around the piece, because that way it won't flip around while I'm working with it. So now that dotted line should be 1/4 of an inch from our solid line. I like to double check, and I can trim down to that dotted line. I want a 1/4 inch seam allowance beyond the solid lines. And I'm using a regular ruler now because since I basted around there, I can't flip up my paper. I don't have anything any thicker to line my add a quarter up. You do not have to use an add a quarter if you don't want to invest in it. It just makes life a little bit simpler. You could always just use a regular ruler and line up your 1/4 of an inch to trim down. If you're going to do a lot of paper piecing, then I definitely recommend the add a quarter. So that's one section. I'm going to put together one other section that uses half square triangles on the camera and then let you go for it from there. Okay, this is section A, and all 4 corners are actually exactly the same. So A1 is BE, so it is beige. So just like we did last time, we're going to flip over and put the wrong side for number 1. It's always just number 1 that gets the wrong side down against the paper. And I want to hold this up to the light, sorry, but you probably can't see it with this lighting, and make sure that I have at least 1/4 of an inch hanging out beyond here. I also want to be sure that I'm going out beyond the seam allowances, so it might not be a bad idea to trim it down to the seam allowance. Once I have it where I want it, I'm going to go ahead and put a pin in that. My next piece is BL, so black. So again, on the wrong side, I'm going to take my black piece, and I'm going to line up my long edge of my triangle with the long edge of the white triangle. And I'm going to move the pin so that it's there. What I want to check before I start sewing, because remember it's a pain in the neck to take out those short stitches, is that when I fold this down, it's going to cover, and I'm pinned back too far. It is. And then I can go ahead and sew between piece A1 and A2. Okay, so again, I'm starting out in the seam allowance and then just sewing on the line between A1 and A2. And I stitch out into the seam allowance on the other side. Again, we are going to fold back, actually you want to do this way, fold back the paper against a card, and this time I'm just going to show you with a regular ruler. Going to line up my 1/4 inch line with that folded back paper and trim off the excess. Now to press, I'm going to press as sewn, and I want to press the seam toward my number 2 piece on here. I'm going to flip it open and then press. A3 is beige again, so it's another beige half square triangle. And I want it to go this way, so it's going to be folded that way. And this is a good time to check and see if it's going to cover. I'm a little high here, so I want to bring it down. They're not hugely oversized. If your seam allowances don't end up being exactly 1/4, it is not the end of the world. You just want to make sure you're covering your piece. Lined up the best you can. We're going to flip it over and put a pin in it. And this time I'm going to be stitching between A2 and A3. I'm starting out in the seam allowance again, stitching on the line. When I get to this end, I want to go a couple of stitches into the next piece. I need to trim off my seam allowance again. And if it wasn't exactly 1/4, this time we're going to be pressing toward the white, so we want to make sure that that black's really not showing. I think mine's okay. So we're going to press that piece that way. My next piece that's going to go on is A4. Before I go there, because I'm starting to have multiple pieces coming together, I'm going to go ahead and fold on that next line that I'm going to stitch. And if your stitching went out into the seam allowance, you can just tear the paper away. So I fold it back on that line, and then I'm going to come in, put my add 1/4 on, and see how it just sits there right on the line when I have the bulk on the one side. I'm going to trim off. And now I am ready to add my last piece to this side. So if I go here and double check, hold it about where the seam allowance is, it's covering. So I'm lining up with that edge that I've already trimmed my 1/4 of an inch. And I want to pin through so it doesn't slip while I'm sewing. And this time I'm stitching on the line between A2 and A4. Sorry, you can't see it. Right there, A2 and A4. Same process again for stitching. I've started in the seam allowance. I want to stitch on the line. In just a couple stitches beyond that line. My 1/4 of an inch should be pretty good because I had trimmed it before I started sewing, so I'm not going to worry about it right now. You can double check it again if you want to. And we're going to press out toward the cream. And now we have one more piece to put onto this unit. So, again, whichever method you're using, and I pick one. I'm just showing different ones so you can decide which you like better. So that. I add 1/4. I'm a little bit narrow down this end, but there's plenty there for a seam allowance. And my final piece is so it is a red triangle. I'm going to line it up, fold to check it, make sure it's going to cover the piece. When I'm satisfied, I will pin it, and it's getting big enough now that I will probably put 2 pins in it. Flip it over, pin. And I'm ready to sew this line. Okay, here we go, starting out in the seam allowance again, sewing on the line. And cut. press the seam as sewn, and then we're going to press the seam toward the red. And here's when you start seeing the benefits of paper piecing. We have a nice point right there. Then I'm going to flip it over, and I will again sew inside the seam allowance and then trim so that I have a 1/4 of an inch beyond my solid line. We'll be making 4 of those, and there are also 2 units that are just 2 squares, so they go together just like the middle one. So I will come back when I have all those units put together. I have all my sections together for the duck and duckling block. I have trimmed them all down a 1/4 of an inch away from the solid line, and before I did that, I stitched all the way around the edge inside the seam allowance. Now I'm ready to start putting them together. We're going to put the columns together here and then attach them to the center. So I'm going to flip this up, and really it should be the right size, but just to be sure, I'm going to put a pin through the corner here and then flip it up and go a pin through the corner on the other side. And I will do the same thing on the other end. Pin. And it went right through the corner. Now I'm not going to fold those pins back. I'm going to put in a pin right next to it. Take out that one, and then a pin right next to that. And then I'm going to take it to the sewing machine, still with my short stitch length, and stitch along this line. This time I'm sewing edge to edge. We definitely want to sew through the seam allowance. Now I'm ready to add the other corner section to the bottom of this column. I'm going to do it exactly the same way. I'm going to match those corners with a pin and then sew on the line. I stitched both sides together exactly the same, and now I'm ready to connect the 2 sides to the middle. On this one, I'm going to match the corners, and I'm also going to match the seams in here. After I stitched these together, I pressed out toward the triangles. There's no special reason other than that's just the way they wanted to go. So, same process. Pin in the corner and through to the corner on the other side. And then the one I'm really interested in is this corner into this corner. And then the same on the other ends, of the other end, this corner to this corner, and finally this one to this one. And then I'm going to come back in and put pins near where I went through. And then I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and just stitch on that line. I repeated the same process on the other side, and then once I had done that, I pressed toward the center. Again, there's no specific reason other than that's the way it wanted to go. I would leave my paper in until you're ready to put this block together with some other blocks, but if you want to, you could take the paper out anywhere that it's not touching the outside edge. We're leaving it in for stability. I am going to take out one section because I want you to see how to do it. A big heavy pin or the back of a seam ripper, if you just score along your stitching lines, that will help to release the paper. And then you're just going to lift it out of there, and you would do that on all the pieces when you were ready to take it out. So that's our duck and ducklings block. On the turnstile block, from both of our dark fabrics, we need 4 1.5 by 4 1/4 inch rectangles. So all I'm going to do is clean cut my 2 edges, just like I always start. And then on the long edge, I want to line up my 4 1/4, and 1.5 times 4 is 6 inches. So I have my 6 inch mark on my short end, my 4 1/4 on the long end. Cut that. 6 minus 1.5 is 4.5. So I just back my ruler up to the 4.5 inch mark. And I'm keeping the long lines on the long edges just to keep everything square. Then I'm going to back up to the 3. And then the 1.5. And I'm going to cut the blue exactly the same way, so I'm not going to film that. The last thing we're going to cut is our 2 lights, and from these we need to get a 4 3/4 inch square. And it's possible that some of you may have some pieces that are really close. If you can't get exactly a 4 3/4 inch square, the triangles that we're going to cut from that square are a little more oversized than some of the others, so just get as close to 4 3/4 as you can. You should be able to get it, but and then I line my 4 3/4 up on the 2 edges that I had just cut straight. And then we're just going to cut this twice on the diagonal to get 4 triangles out of it. So going this way, and this way. So that gives us 4 triangles, and you'll do exactly the same thing on the other light piece. For the turnstile block, we're going to be making 2 blocks. Each block takes a light and a dark. You can decide which lights and darks go together. Each block is divided into 2 sections. So here's my pattern for one section that I have already trimmed down. There's no key this time, but if you just keep in mind that all the triangles are light and then all the almost rectangles are the dark, you're good. So our first piece is a straight piece because it's numbered number 1 with my foundation piecing. So I'm going to take, in this case I'm using red, my red strip, lay it on with the wrong side against the back side of the pattern. I want to check to be sure that it's covering all the way. And it is. You're just going to have to take my word for it because you can't see it in the light right now. I'm going to pin that piece on. And then my next piece is a triangle. That's number 2. So it's going to go that way once it's sewn. So I can just test to make, because if I put it this way it would be wrong. So just test it to make sure it's kind of matching the shape of the block. I'm going to flip it up and match my raw edges here. And I do have about 1/4 inch by eyeball there. And then I will pin those pieces together. And just like in the ducks and ducklings, I'm going to stitch on the line between number 1 and number 2. As usual, I'm starting a little beyond the line I'm going to stitch on. And when I get to the other end, I'm going to go a couple stitches beyond as well. Because I didn't check my 1/4 exactly, I'm going to trim it down to 1/4 this time. So I'm going to fold on my stitching line. And I'm going to put the groove down on here. and trim off my excess. And then I'm going to press this way. So I've pressed. I'm going to go ahead and trim my seam allowance so I can line everything up perfectly. So whether you're using the Add a Quarter Plus or your note card, we're going to fold back on the line that's going to be between 2 and 3. In this case, it's also between 1 and 3. Fold it back. Line the groove up with the edge of the paper. And trim. So my next piece on here is going to be another dark because it's the long skinny one. So I'm going to flip it over and I can just line it up now, this piece, with the bottom here and with that edge I just trimmed over here. And pin. And then I'm going to sew on that line right here, the one that I had folded on. You can double check this 1/4 inch seam allowance, make sure that you kept everything straight, trim it if you need to. Then I pressed my piece and I'm going to once again trim up before I stitch. So I'm putting my Add a Quarter Plus or your note card on the line between 3 and 4. And I'm going to fold that back. And then on the groove side, I'm going to trim off my extra beyond the 1/4 inch. And my final piece on this section is a triangle. It's going to go this way. So again, because I've trimmed it up, I can line it up with my long edge here. And it's working out on my bottom too. So across the bottom I've lined it up. And then I'm going to pin, just like I have every other time, and stitch. I pressed my last piece, and so now I'm ready to stitch in the seam allowance all the way around the edge, which is what I have done on this piece. And I'm going to come back in now with a ruler and trim a 1/4 inch away from my solid line, which really should be on the dotted line. But I would rather make sure it's a 1/4 than trust the dotted line. It's a good check. And then this pattern has trimmed off the corners on the triangle so that everything, you don't have any dog ears when you're finished. So I will go ahead and trim those, and I'm just going to follow the dotted line in that case. So you're going to just make 4 units, so one's going to be red and one's going to be navy, and trim them up like this, and then we'll be putting them together. To finish the turnstile block, all we have to do is join the 2 sides together. There are 2 places we're going to want to match, or 3 places we're going to want to match. We want to match here in the center, the seam line, and then our 2 corners. So same process. I am going through on that point and then through to the other side to make sure they match up. And then a pin in the corners. I'll check the other side, that's good. It really should match up pretty well. And then in this corner, as long as your pin goes straight through, it should match up well. Okay, once you have them all matched up, then we're just going to put some additional pins in to hold it in place. Pull our vertical ones out. And then I'm going to stitch from one end to the other, and I think you've seen enough of me stitching. I'm going to go all the way from the edge in this case to the other side. There are my two finished turnstile blocks. I chose to press that last seam open. It distributed the bulk a little bit better. If you want to, I'm not going to do it yet, you can sew the two blocks together. They will be sewn together eventually. I am leaving my paper in because every single piece goes out to the outside edge. So until I sew something else on the edges, I'm not taking my paper out because it helps to stabilize the block.